in nature, from what I've seen, every organism will seek to expand, ultimately will seek to expand at the cost of other organisms. So war is part of nature. And therefore, if humans are part of nature, war is quite natural, along with peace.
Sure. I'm with you so far. Heraclitus is with you, right? He says war is the father of all things. And he says, Homer is an idiot for saying that, it would be better if we could banish war from the earth, because he says if we could, then all things would cease to exist. But the challenge is that Heraclitus is using the word war in a more complex way. He's using it as a metaphor for the dialectic and for palintropy, and pointing out how the struggle between things, when properly harnessed into a living system, is what leads to health and vitality. But when not properly harnessed into a living system, it leads to chaos. And the Greeks are very attuned to this difference between, is your conflict increasing the overall health, or is it decreasing the overall health? Chaos versus cosmos is central to the Greek worldview, whereas we completely erase that distinction. And we use the word war in the same way we use the word slavery, as sort of a arm wavy, vague abstraction. And then we throw everything into that same category, including things that are opposites. And we say, well, if the one is good, then the other is good. So we think, for
It's
example,
necessary to make it, well, it might be useful to make a distinction between social things and natural things.
yes,
We conceive of living in a society, if we have a society, we conceive of living in peace or limiting conflict. But on the larger scale, the human body is built for conflict. So war is a natural aspect.
Well,
Now,
this
whether I like war or not doesn't make any difference. Nature has its own rules.
well, this is getting kind of serious because I'm thinking that what you're talking about, the relationship between capitalism and mercantilism, which is, in other words, capital done in the proper way is supposed to harmonize the relation between conflict and the self, whereas mercantilism is really out for yourself and destroy the other. That's completely different. The problem is we don't have the proper balance in capital, so we're moving into mercantilism. It's gonna take place.
well, to
Uh,
take us back to the text with what you're
yes, let's
talking
do
about,
that.
the issue here is self-providence, it's phronesis. So war in pursuit of phronesis is healthy and leads to the greater health of the system. But war that destroys phronesis is unhealthy and not to be sought out. And if we erase that distinction and call both of them war and say, therefore, war is good and natural and all wars are the things that we should do, we're completely missing the point of the Greeks. This isn't what they're saying. And that's fine if we want to stay in the modern worldview where, A equals A and, A does not equal B. If we want to stick with these binary abstract categories, we can, and the modern world will reward us for it. But it won't bring us any closer to being able to get out of the trap of the modern worldview. To get out of the trap of the modern worldview, we need to see some examples of alternative worldviews. The Greeks are offering us one in which these distinctions between what's health promoting and what's health destroying are everything, and that you would never mix them together and give them a single word that refers to both
But
of them.
there is that crossover into the social again. If we use the word going Hume, should, ought, to owe, yes, in a society, somebody owes me some money. That's a relevant concept. In nature, no, I don't know. I can't see the word owe in nature.
Well, should and owe are different here because Aristotle talks about the arete of a species as being what is its excellence that allows it to pursue its phronesis. So, why are they the way that they are? Why are they interested in the things they're interested in? Why do they do the things they do? And the Greeks don't believe it's just a bunch of meaningless stuff that's happening. They believe there's teleology, there's direction to it. The cheetah tends to do what it does because it has evolved to a state of pursuing its phronesis. And in that state, it's never going to, sit around a bunch of lectures about how the other cheetahs over in the other valley are evil and must be destroyed, and then, construct weaponry and go over there and exterminate them all. That's a human thing to do. And that's one of the ways in which we can talk about war. But they will compete for mates, they'll compete for territory, they'll compete for prey, and they'll fight. But all of those forms of conflict are phronesis driven, and they never lead the other direction. It just doesn't happen. And so this is how the slime molds don't need all this complex apparatus to act in their own phronesis. They know when to fight, they know when not to fight, they know when to cooperate, they know when to be individuals. And they know that because that's what evolution has shaped them to be interested in. They just don't notice the opportunities to fight world wars that we notice, right? And they can't talk themselves into abstract reasoning, that leads them to think that they ought to engage in this behavior that's against their own interests. So it's one thing, and I'm with you, Stephen, as far as you go, if you're trying to caution people to understand that conflict is part of life. And if it weren't for conflict, we wouldn't be alive, right? I mean, when the leopard sneaks into your cave at night and wants to eat you, if you don't want to engage in conflict, you can just be somebody's meal. There's going to be times when there has to be conflict in the pursuit of phronesis. But
put that one in society, actually.
Yes, but that's a far cry from saying that world wars are natural and healthy, right? There are things that we do as people that have nothing to do with phronesis, and they have everything to do with the way that the human psyche is structured differently from the way that the psyche of other species is.
Well, that's a standard philosophical model. Yeah, we have nature, we have human, and if you want to go further, we have supernature beyond the human. But yes, this idea that we can take the human and separate it from nature is valid philosophically, as you pointed out, Hegel's man, God, and nature.
Yeah, and you can sort of see the ways in which this is where the nuance gets difficult, right? That the word nature also has multiple meanings, both to the Greeks and to Hegel and to us. And this is one of the few places where the multiple meanings that we have in English are the same multiple meanings that the ancient Greeks had. So they use the word nature both to refer to this whole thing, which we also do, but they also use it to refer to the nature of a culture or the nature of a species or the nature of an individual. And we do that too. That's a piece of ambivalent meaning that can go either of two directions, in which we line up nicely with the Greeks. So they would say that, there are ways in which Homo sapiens can act against its own phronesis in a very counternatural way, in a way that other species don't do. And you can say, on the one hand, that's deeply unnatural, right? There's a real problem here. I mean, species that survive don't do that, which really should raise some questions for us. That's one of the ways in which we could apply the word nature here. But the other way that we could apply the word nature, and both we could do it in English and the Greeks would do it in ancient Greek, is that the reason that we act in this unnatural way is that it is our nature to do so. Our character, the structure of our inner drives and teleology makes us unnatural. It is natural for us to be unnatural, which is a fascinating paradox.
Okay, there's 2 points, nature and human. You're bringing those up. Now, the other thing, which of course all the atheists will doubt, the idea of supernature in our individuality would be expressed by the idea of a divine spark or a monad. So the supernaturalists will claim us, the individual, is something beyond the human as well. Of course, the secularists, the materialists will say, "Oh no, we as conscious entities and whatever we are just purely the human medium. There is no divine spark, as the Gnostics would believe. I'm this divine spark. I'm looking at this planet. I'm out of here."
Right. Yeah. So this is what the challenge is going to be for us right now. It's hard enough for us to keep in mind our own worldview separate from this project that we've been engaged on for over a year of constructing an approximation of the ancient worldview and comparing and contrasting them. This is a complicated thing to do. It's very hard. It's causing us to question all kinds of things that we're not used to questioning. But when we finish chapter 4, I think in a few more months, I think we're going to do it this year. We finish chapter 4, we'll be entering the section on the medieval worldview. And when that happens, it's going to go from being a two-body problem, as hard as that is, to a three-body problem. Because now we've got to try to understand this third, really quite alien worldview, very different from either of the other two, with its own logic, its own ways of interpretation, and so forth. The things you're talking about, like that ability to escape out of this world into the other world, these are fundamental to the medieval worldview. They become the centerpiece for their cosmology, their morality, and everything else. So it's one of the reasons I'm always tickled when you bring this stuff up, because it's this is where we're going, right? This is going to be the centerpiece, and ultimately, we can't understand modernity as a worldview until after we understand the medieval worldview, because we're their children. A vast swath of assumptions and principles from the medieval worldview are still present in the modern worldview in a taken for granted, unexamined way, in which we don't see those connections. We always emphasize the differences. Say, look, we're atheists, we must be totally different. And then we spend all our time planning to go to space and escape off the planet. It's like you said, where does that drive to escape come from? Well, we had 1,000 years in which that was the whole purpose of civilization, was to get out of here and go to heaven, right? That was what it was all about.
And so Star Trek, curiosity. We have our rebels with the Christians, the Gnostics, troublemakers.
Yeah.
But where are they at the time of ancient Greece?
Yeah.
Were they in Egypt as well? We just didn't, they were kept. Maybe the Greeks and the Egyptians found the Gnostic, found the man who said, I don't want to be part of this world. Well, we have the Stoics, they're a little bit like that in a certain sort of way. But there are legends that the Egyptians looked upon such a person as sick, and they cultivated arts like the temple sleep to get them back into humanity. I don't know if that's quite true, but there was this legend of the temples engaged in what were their own type of psychological practice.
Yes.
To get the person back into tune with human life.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, we're gonna spend a good long time exploring all this stuff. But our challenge is going to be, first we got to finish nailing down the ancient worldview, because if we don't, then what'll happen is when we turn to the medieval, we'll start sloughing off our hard-won victories about understanding how to see from the ancient worldview, and we'll start turning them back into a caricature, because that's what modernity prefers to interpret these past epochs as. So this is why I'm taking the time in chapter 4 to make sure we pin it down real good.
Well, broadly, this is about the pursuit of excellence. The Greeks had a pursuit of excellence, a pursuit of the Aristoi.
Yes.
And Kenneth Smith is saying to, late 20th century, where's it gone?
Right.
In your world.
Right. Yeah, and the pursuit of phronesis, is just if we recognize the Greeks as having admirable traits at all, we're willing to admit as moderns that maybe they had a pursuit of excellence. The Olympic Games strike us as something that we can understand in our own way from a modern perspective, but we really don't grasp this idea that the pursuit of phronesis was actually the more central goal. Excellence for its own sake is like in third place after the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of phronesis. Then after that comes the pursuit of excellence as a means to an end, and also as a way of dramatizing the importance of the struggle that we need to learn to embrace. And this, again, Stephen, goes back to your comments about conflict being central. Heraclitus and the other Greeks talk about this a lot. You have to teach people to not just go along with everything, not to just pacify themselves. You have to learn the virtue and the duty to struggle to do better tomorrow than you did yesterday. And that's all tied up with conflict and competition and all these things that they tried to dramatize for us. And so the pursuit of excellence acts as a way to help illustrate for the average Greek, that this could be good and could be spectacular, so that you can prepare them to also then struggle for wisdom and for phronesis, which are the harder things for them to grasp. It's like the finger pointing to the moon. The guy throwing the discus farther than anybody's ever thrown it before is their way of pointing at the struggle to be wiser and to be more self-provident. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you mentioned about conflict. I'm wondering whether the conflict is essentially a conflict because you know that you'll have to be in conflict with others, or whether the conflict is really a conflict with yourself. In other words, yourself as you are versus the self that you could be, which is a different self. And that's a different kind of conflict, it seems to me, the inner conflict versus the outer conflict. It seems to me we too often stress the outer conflict. I'm not denying that doesn't exist, but it seems to me the inner conflict is the more important one to prepare yourself eventually about the outer conflict. And with that conflict, then you will understand when to avoid conflict versus when to engage in conflict. Without the inner struggle, you would never understand that.
Yeah, yeah. That is something that that the Greeks talk about. The difficulty of getting people to understand the internal struggle, but the importance of doing it. And so you use the external struggle as a metaphor to teach people how to do that. All of this stuff, really, you can see why it would arise in a warrior culture. So they start out with the external conflict, and then they say, if you want the external conflict to be successful, then you need to conduct an internal conflict to make yourself better. And only if you do that are you going to be able to win the external conflict. So there's this, you see this in traditional Okinawan martial arts too. There is this sense of the interrelationship between the two conflicts, the internal and the external. And so even people who only value winning externally, beating somebody else, can be brought around to understand that if they want that, then they're going to have to invest in the internal struggle. Because without that, they're never going to be much good at the external struggle. In the Iliad, Homer has a lot of sarcastic asides distinguishing the kinds of warriors who are just brutes from the ones who are, who are aristic about it. And that's one of his ways of dramatizing, who has taken it upon themselves to try to become an Aristos versus who's just a thug with a club, who happens to be big or strong or what have you, or more violent.
Could you name a few names out of that, the Iliad?
Well, part of what's interesting about it is it all depends on which city-state the perspective is momentarily shifting to, because frequently they would have rivalries. And so one city-state might feel like the national hero of the other city-state is a thug, whereas the other city-state might think, no, their national hero is the idiot. But the classic example, which isn't in the Iliad but predates it, is Theseus versus Heracles. Heracles is presented as a grunt. Yeah, he wins a lot of battles, but it's because he's so strong. And sometimes he's clever, and that's cool, but it's always sort of a animal cunning. Whereas Theseus is presented as he's brilliant. Yes, he's big and strong. He can lift the boulder and get the sword and the sandals that his father left for him when he's an adolescent. But his real gift is, the ability to think through problems and solve them. And so I think Heracles was the hero of Tyrans, whereas Theseus is the hero of Athens, and the difference you can sort of see there.
Okay, contrast Hector and Achilles for us.
Yeah, well, Achilles has the divine spark. Going back to Joe's question, he's descendant from the gods, and it gives him a drive and a prowess to excellence that is conspicuous. Everybody can see it. Whenever Achilles doesn't want to fight, the Greeks fail against Troy. It's only when they can get him out of his tent and get him pointed in the right direction that they win. but he's not as moral or aristic a character as Hector, who's really presented as the person we should be emulating. So they're saying, a human being isn't going to be born with the blood of Zeus within them, or Themis, or Thetis, as the case may be. So we don't get to follow Achilles' example literally, because we're never going to be that good. But we could follow the example of Hector, who shows us, that if you pursue the heuristic values, then you can even hold your own against somebody like Achilles. As I recall in the Iliad, Hector has to be distracted for a moment by something, and that's when Achilles strikes him down. The gods have to put their thumb on the scales. And so there's sort of an argument being made here about what can we emulate. And the fact that Achilles then behaves so badly with Hector's body is used again to dramatize. Don't be a jerk like Achilles, right? I mean, that guy's terrible. You want to be more like Hector.
Three Stooges, Achilles the heel.
Yes, that's right. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Conflict. Phil brought it up, and I think the reading this week is talking about it. That sentence where it says, an idiotes is self-doomed to retardate life mentally. But the most important part, if we go down a couple more words, is where it says a deficiency in values and character, lack of drive to rise to the active agonist inner life, where the full repertoire of powers of self-mastery can unfold. So
Yeah.
conflict, either inner or outer, is a growth mechanism.
Yes.
And conflict avoidance has its own psychopathology.
That's right.
So
That's right.
that's all I have to say. So that's represented there. And I think moderns, I know in my time of working, I've met so many grown men who avoid conflict, and grown women too. Let me not be specific here, who avoid conflict specifically because they think there might be an altercation, or they don't want to make the decision, the unpleasant decision that goes along, take the choice that goes along with this particular situation. But conflict is definitely a growth mechanism.
Yes.
And the second thing I wanted to say is, and I'm not picking on you, Phil. Phil talks about the inequities of capitalism. But ever since civilization has been set up for the exchange of goods and later services, there's never been, I think it's never been equitable. The barter system depends on if the guy is your friend. Then the price you got was more equitable. Or if you didn't like him, then you charged him a higher price. And I think as the way we paid for goods and services evolved over the ages, we carried some of that inequity. So it's never, ever equitable.
Well, Sharon, I think you mischaracterized me. I think I do have a gripe with capitalism, but I was trying to make the contrast between capitalism as the way it is still not mercantilism, because mercantilism is, in a sense, a kind of colonialism where you're going to take beyond your needs from some others, which is different from capital, which is just mere conflict. The conflict there is, in a sense, you could push it so far that it becomes almost mercantilism. That's a distinction I'm drawing. I'm not singing hymns to capitalism. I'm saying that it's hell of a lot better than mercantilism, which is really exploitation.
It always has been and always will be, so long as we're human. I think that's part of the nature.
Well, I think of your human, you also have to consider the other at the other.
Yes, you do.
Time.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Some of the time, though, not most of the time. And I think the Greeks talk about that too.
Yes. Yes, and this is all really on point for the second half of paragraph 10, which includes the sentence that you quoted, Sharon. Now, all of this is talking about the issue of an idiotes, from which is derived from the Greek idios, meaning one's own. All of this is talking about when people fail to recognize the extent to which they're blinded by having only one point of view. An idios is concerned with his own preferences, his own ideologies, his own family, his own home, his own neighborhood, his own favorite foods, his own favorite classical performance. I mean, he's trapped within the perspective he's born into, which is looking through his own eyes, hearing through his own ears, and so forth. So there is the Greeks would argue that's not an example of the mature adult human mind. That's an infantilized mind. It's a mind that never fully developed. Its course of development has been well, he uses the word retardate, but he means it's been held back. It's failed to proceed to its destination. It's like an apple tree that'll never produce apples. It's not, Aristotle would say, it's not indicative of the species. It's an outlier. And
The myth that all humans, every human you know, will become a mature adult.
yeah, the Greeks didn't
No.
believe that.
Sorry.
Yeah, the Greeks don't believe that. They're making it very clear that they don't think that. But what they're doing is they're talking about, so what is the nature of these people who don't become mature adults? What is their nature? And then when you're trying to think about how you structure a civilization, you have to take that into account and say, if you have different people with different natures, then you need to structure your society in such a way that it can be healthy for human beings to exist in that mix. What you can't do is do what we do in modernity. I mean, obviously you can, but the Greeks don't think it's healthy if you pretend that there aren't any differences. If we just pretend, for example, that everybody who hits age 18 is an adult, well, then we're gonna, we know what happens. We've seen plenty of examples of people who are 18 or older who behave in childish ways. But if we're all in denial about that, and the laws are written pretending that doesn't happen, and the economic system is structured assuming that doesn't happen, and so forth, then we get this mismatch between the structure of society and the actual nature of the community that exists, which creates big challenges to for our survival. To the Greeks, these are the central issues of politics and philosophy. But in modernity, we sort of sweep that all away and say, look, we're all born the same. We all have the same gifts. That's just how it is. And we're going to take that as self-evident, meaning there could be as much evidence disproving it as possible, but we won't look at any of that. We're going to suppress that. And then we're going to build a utopian society based on the premise that is demonstrably false, just assuming that everybody has a nature that they don't in fact actually have. I'll come back and continue this in a bit, but George, tell us what's on your mind.
Hello. I'm gonna take off my video because the light is glaring. Sorry. Okay. What I want to do, at least in the first instance, put this in the context of ancient Greece, which is that there was, and even throughout the Roman period, there was a very important political issue, kind of mental construct between the civilized and the barbarian. People that live tribal lives, this and that, right? Hunter-gatherers, to the extent that that still existed. And that was what differentiated. It was this notion that they were, I'm going to use the word idiots, right? Because it's easier for me to say that. They were idiots, right? They were really not much above animals, right? They were just trying to strive for day-to-day existence. They were not elevated. And so that's what differentiates the civilized person from the barbarian, right? That they achieved a kind of inner growth, they had a broader perspective. They were not just sort of, people that were just motivated by their greed or their something. They were again, they were civilized. It's almost, I think that's the almost, we have that sense of connotation, but it's almost that is the denotative definition. They think about art and culture, and they think about community, right? And I'm going to say, I'm going to take issue. You brought up modernity, Rick. I'm going to take issue with your view of modernity. I think you're really speaking to really capitalist thinking in terms of, I'm going to be very specific here, in terms of Adam Smith. Adam Smith argued that the only way to manage a global economy was to base that economy on greed. And so that's a very, again, self-centered, material acquisitiveness. So it's not that modernity, right, doesn't have that division between the barbarian and the civilized, is that is at the heart of capitalism, the idea that we are incapable of being elevated and acting on the better, the more beneficial aspects of ourselves. Let me help, thinking about the world, engaging in art and culture. In capitalism, the idea is that, okay, we're just base creatures motivated by our immediate senses. And I think about that reference to the animals, and contrasting, talking about the reference to animals, how versus versus people, which is that animals are just concerned about the immediate. Humans think about the future, they fantasize, they have imagination, right? And so Smith's idea really is that, and not to really be too critical of Smith, because he's writing at a completely different time, but really even in a contemporary period, that people are not really much above animals, in the sense that we're just impulsive, just do what's right in front of us. Again, we do not think about the broader community in a meaningful sense, or only give that lip service. I hope my comments are of some help.
Thank you, George. So, yeah, I mean, these are some complex issues. You talked a little bit about barbarian versus civilized, and that's what we're taking a moment on. The Greeks believed that everyone who doesn't speak Greek is barbarian. And they believed that the reason was that they almost worshipped their language. They thought their language had a unique expressiveness and an ability to talk about the issues that are relevant to phronesis, to distinguish what is healthy from what's not healthy. And they were concerned that other languages, it's not just that they sound like gibberish, bar, 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 but that those languages lack the ability to make the critical distinctions. Like they can't distinguish, they don't have words to distinguish between a war that advances phronesis and a war that advances self-destruction. They just call them all wars. And the same with forms of slavery and so on. So they thought, you can't speak in those languages and think in an intelligent fashion. But they then subdivided the barbarians into the northern I was reading this in the book Images of the Slave in Ancient Greek Society. They then subdivided the barbarians into two groups. They said the northern barbarians are not very bright, but they're very brave. They're full of courage, but they're kind of dumb. So, the Germans and the Celts and so forth. But the southern barbarians, and they're thinking here of the Egyptians and the Persians and so forth, they say they're very smart and creative and artistic, but they're cowards. They're not really willing to fight. And they thought that what made themselves civilized is that they were a wise warrior culture. So they were both willing to be, to think and to be creative and so forth, but also they were willing to fight for the things that they believed in. And they thought that tension was the thing that distinguished truly civilized people from either sort of ersatz decadent civilized people or from completely uncivilized, but at least brave people in the North. So this issue, though, of idiotes and self-interest, they didn't see that as restricted to the barbarians. They thought even among the Greeks, the vast majority of Greeks behave as idiots too. That you've got the douloi, you've got the banausoi, and then you've got some people who are in the class of the aristoi, but who really are douloi or banausoi. Just they've inherited a position that they don't actually, they're not actually able to be responsible for. And in a larger sense, even though they're willing to set aside true aristoi as maybe not being idiots, they still sort of prefer to describe it as not being entirely idiots. That is to say, it's the human condition that we're all sort of stupid. And our stupidity comes from our obsession with our own perspectives and preferences. There was a session, I think about 6 months ago, that was inspired by Emily Vermeer's book about death among the lyric poets, depictions of death in lyric poetry and art. And in that, they said to the Greeks, to be mortal meant three critical things, and all three of these things were important. And you could sort of interpret all this discussion of idiocy in terms of this definition of mortality, because some forms of idiocy, they're willing to say, okay, the barbarians have more of that than we do. Or they might be willing to say, okay, the douloi and banausoi have more of it than the aristoi. But ultimately, the shared mortality with these three factors is what's going to ultimately determine what they consider to be idiocy. So the first is that we die. Obviously, this is what moderns are willing to acknowledge. Yes, as mortals, we die. Although there are plenty of moderns who don't want to admit that that will always be true. We sort of imagine medicine will cure death at some point. We're fantasizing about it happening in our lifetime. So, but the second thing that the Greeks thought was every bit as central to being immortal is that our creative works die too. You know, the songs we write, the paintings we paint, the statues we carve, the cities we build, they die too. Even if it takes them longer, sooner or later they also collapse. And that's a huge frustration for a mortal, because one of the great consolations of having to die is the hope that you can do some good that outlasts you. Okay, maybe I die, but you know, I wrote this great song, or I healed these people, or I planted this forest. Maybe at least that can outlive me. But the Greeks say, well, you know, to be mortal means, yeah, it may outlive you, but it's going to die too. Cities and civilizations die. They were well aware of it. They could see the ruins everywhere. And that's part of being mortal. But the third part was the part they hated the most, more than anything. He said, you could still make your peace with having to die and with having all your creative works eventually die too, if only we weren't so stupid. They said, to be mortal is to be trapped within a mortal perspective. Instead of seeing the whole cosmos, we're always looking from the same tiny spot, which is where we are. And the problem with doing that is we miss almost everything. It's an infinite cosmos. We're a tiny finite being that not only is only here to see part of what's going on, but we can only see a tiny fraction that's near us and that we're facing, frankly, at any given moment. And the result is even the smartest people in the world, you know, they cite examples like Oedipus or Odysseus, create catastrophes from the things that they don't understand about the consequences of their own actions. And they say this level, this third factor of mortality is the fundamental problem of what it means to be an idiot. It's that you can be as smart as you want, but when your perspective is as limited as a mortal's perspective, your own intelligence turns against itself in a tragic inversion until it can be used every bit as much to blind ourselves from the truth as it can be to try to expose part of the truth to us. And they said, this is what distinguishes the sacred or the divine from the human, is that the gods are, at least in their chosen areas, like Poseidon in the ocean, he's omniscient about the ocean. He knows everything about the ocean. He's not missing some piece of the picture the way an experienced human navigator would be. And that distinction between, say, Poseidon and an experienced human goer, they would say, you know, that renders the mortal an idiot. There may be gradations of idiocy, right? The experienced sea captain is far less of an idiot than someone who's never been on a boat. But still, compared to the big picture and compared to what's necessary for life, the Greeks would argue even the most experienced of us is still an idiot because of our mortality.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that very interesting explanation. Thank you. I mean, I guess what I want to drive at is the idea is that the civilized man, in terms of gradations, etc., and so forth, is elevated, right, beyond his own immediate needs. And so in that way, right, if you're dominated simply by your base needs, you're even more blind to the cosmos.
Right.
Right.
That's
civilized
totally
man thinks about the cosmos, thinks about community, thinks about the world, and tries to reconcile himself within that world. Right. Whereas the idiot is just driven by his own material acquisitiveness. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. We might use an adjective, right? And say the difference between the complete idiot and the partial idiot.
Yes.
The wisest of us is a partial idiot, you know, like Socrates. If I am wise, it is only because I know that I know nothing. He's only a partial idiot. But the person who is absolutely convinced that he sees reality the way that it actually is, and that reality is here to please him, that's a complete idiot. He's like,
Well, yeah, let me say this, just let me understand this other point, which is, and you really touch on this, I think, and this is important, is that, and really, it's really, you outlined it very well, but let me just sum it up this way, that life is a process, right? We are continuously trying to overcome our idiocy. And so, there's never a stopping point, right? Because you said, your knowledge, we all die, right? So, and life is an ontology, it's a process. It's not a thing, it's a process.
right, right. Thank you, George. That's right on the money, right? That's why their word for nature, phusis, means becoming. It's a
Thank
process.
you, brother. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty interesting, and I think Phil was actually capturing it well when he was talking about the internal and the external. In terms of, it's the idea of understanding yourself. I mean, this is just kind of, some basic, Stoic philosophy. It's the idea of okiosis. So that the idea that you become aware of oneself, and then you realize that the importance in the relationship to the other. So it's the self and the other. So it's a journey of understanding yourself, but that it's not only about yourself, that you don't exist independent of everyone else. So, and I think that differs from the system that you exist in, because the system that you exist in is an external. So it's about the journey within, and then how you interact. So the difficulty that becomes is that where we no longer think about things in terms of, I would say, what is unknown or what is up to us. We tend to think that everything is up to us. So there's this element of, what Epictetus would say is what is up to us and what is not up to us, and what is in your control and what is not. And when we start to think we can control these variables, is when things really get out of hand, I would say, is that we start to intellectualize everything and think that we can control for every aspect of society, or every aspect of our lives, and there is no sense of limits, I would say. As we were just talking about when you were mentioning the idea of limits, with limits of living itself. So that we're basically, but anyway, this journey within is actually an important point, because within that, that you start to assume, you start to see where your responsibilities lie, both as an individual and as a citizen, and that gives way to the idea of cosmopolitanism, and where you start to see yourself as not just a citizen of a country or in one particular role. You see yourself as a citizen of the world. So therefore, that kind of helps shape your ethics. And once you see that, then we went over the section with Arete, the idea of the pursuit of excellence within that, because you've looked within, you start to understand yourself, your limitations, your abilities, then you pursue excellence within that framework. So you're seeing your role, and your excellence is seen because you see yourself part of something bigger than yourself. You see yourself part of a society, not just as something, as an individual seeking their own personal pleasure. And so all of this leads to how we start to develop things like role ethics, and how kind of a society needs, how a society becomes functional. But you realize that only by understanding yourself. And so it all starts with you. And then you assume the responsibilities that you have within that society as a whole. But knowing that connection, understanding the connection, and understanding it's the relationships and the between each other, and not necessarily the objects that we create, is really the most important thing. And I say that because I find that I think where modernity does fail is that they tend to think it's about material only, and material goods only in particular. And I think that as opposed to thinking about as to the relationships between ourselves and they start to think about the objects themselves. So all of that is to say that is the maturation process. I would say that the Greeks fully did comprehend. Does that mean they always did it? Probably not. But and definitely not. I mean, just considering some of the conflicts that they were engaged with. But nonetheless, I think that they had a very good idea of the formula of what it meant to be able to understand themselves and their place in the world. Anyway, just a thought.
Good thoughts. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, this what you're talking about, this is what this second half of this paragraph is all about. And ultimately, by extension, really all of chapter 4 is wrestling with these concerns that you're addressing, that you're bringing up here. This is what the Greeks are worried about. And you can see it in the way that someone like Socrates, and not just Socrates, but really any philosophically educated Greek would have said, of course I'm an idiot. We're all idiots. The question is, what are we doing to try to overcome our idiocy that is our birthright, right? How are we struggling to push beyond that? Whereas if you ask a modern, he's going to think you're insulting him. I'm no idiot. Right? We think in terms of these idiotic, simple, you are or you aren't, it's true or it's false. Some people are all good and some people are all bad. And so I'm not an idiot. You're an idiot. If you call me an idiot, that makes you an idiot, because that way I can ignore what you said. Because don't you attack me by accusing me of not being a god of knowledge, right? We all think it's our birthright to be gods of knowledge who see reality the way it actually is. The idea that we're the opposite of that by nature, that evolution has yielded us up into the world in such a way that we have a very high intelligence, but a very low wisdom. A wisdom that's so low that even a single-celled organism like a slime mold amoeba is more often successful in pursuing what's healthy for it than I am. Well, the modern can't conceive of the idea that wisdom and intelligence are separate from each other. And if they can, they certainly can't buy the idea that, if I'm really, really smart and educated, that I may nevertheless, for my entire life, be a fool just because I'm human. The framework of Pico della Mirandola and others in modernity is this idea that human intelligence is this glorious accomplishment of evolution or God's gift, or however we want to explain how we got it. And now that we have it, we can go forth into the world, clearing away ignorance and laying out justice. And we can do all that because of the glories of the human mind. This is a framework that makes us intolerant of accepting the fundamental idiocy of the human perspective, which is that, it's a great big world and it's a teeny tiny viewpoint that we're trying to look out of to understand that world. We don't really want to come to grips with it, even though it's obvious. And part of what that tells us is that reluctance has nothing to do with what we would think of as reason or rationality or science or any of that. It has to do with ideology. We are ideologically programmed to not want to accept what the Greeks thought was the starting point of having an adult life, which is, we have this problem, we're idiots. And so therefore, we have an obligation to struggle to overcome it. We just think ignorance is something you solve by pouring facts into somebody's head. And that's why we educate children the way we do. Sit down, shut up, and listen, and take tests to prove that you have absorbed the knowledge, and surely, goodness and utopia shall follow. And that's all we need to do is pour some facts into you. There's no deeper problem to be solved, we think. And this is where you see the direction between the modern and ancient worldviews most clearly. As well as, the fact that we would have the reasonable man theory in law. Who do you want to get to be jurors in a trial by jury? Well, you want the person's peers, and you just screen out the excessively unreasonable person, and you'll end up with reasonable people. We believe the law says reasonable people, have a reasonable grasp on right and wrong and true and false. And they have that because we've put them in the category. Ipso facto, we just state that it's true that people like this exist. The Greeks didn't think anybody like that existed. They thought the very best of them struggled to try to partially grasp those things. Whereas we think people are mostly born that way unless they're defective. Right. So we don't want to hear the word idiot bandied about unless somebody has some sort of brain damage or obvious cognitive damage. Otherwise, we want to hear that we're all rational, reasonable, enlightened human beings. And our reluctance to accept that starting position is part of why we never develop Aristoi in the modern world. So we think we're sort of born Aristoi for free. No need to struggle. You just click, you got it. Just click your heels together and you're free. Anyway, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, if I may just really quickly, because I think you bring up a very important point, is that when we start to think of things in terms of categories, we say, very all good or all bad. And what that does is essentially say, well, somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. And it's like, no, that's not it. And what you're failing to see is the likelihood of you being in that particular circumstance. And if you were in that circumstance, how would you have reacted? And that's a complete lack of kind of imagination. And so you start to think of yourself as kind of primary because you did it within, within your own will, if you will, that everything was based on you. And so that, which is lacks any kind of nuance or any understanding. So by looking at yourself as I don't want to say idiot, but looking at yourself as fallible at the very least.
Yes.
And seeing yourself as that. And that is part of what happens when you do the journey within, is that you understand your own personal limitations. And by understanding your limitations, you say, oh, that could be me. And then you're like, well, then from there, you can start to cultivate a certain degree of however you want to phrase it, sympathy or empathy, depending on, how you think about it. But many times that I, think about some of these emotions that we feel, it's even the examination of these emotions, like the idea of, I often find, and maybe this is just maybe recent terms, but like in modernity is the idea as a shame or something like that as being something negative.
Mm-hmm.
And no, it's telling you something. And it's this idea that you're looking and why are you ashamed to be in the first place? And so why are you, not being shamed by somebody else, but why do you feel shame? Possibly because you maybe acted in a way that maybe not pro-social, not in a sense that where you're thinking about your relationship with other people. So therefore, from that perspective, it's a much more nuanced perspective as to understanding yourself and your emotions and how you relate to everybody else. So anyway, that's all I would just, I think that these are important points to all consider is about, especially the one thing modernity you can honestly say is that it over-categorizes. I mean, clearly, and every time. And if you want to go back to even something like the way we even measure intelligence,
right?
That's considered literally, you can almost put the good life on a scale.
Right.
And it's like, are you out of your mind? I mean, like, do you really think that that's all that matters? Because it's going to end really badly. If you think that the Goddard scale is going to be it, and that this is the way they'll go forward, and that's going to lead to a lot of kind of biases actually being, essentially our bias would probably, would get worse, not better. In other words, our ability to overcome our bias within that,
Right.
because, you have these statistics, but that goes back to the idea of facts. And, when you're just fed facts, you're no longer asking questions. So it's like, I have the answers, yes, no. And so that there's all this nuance that gets lost in this whole process. That's really, that leads to the divisions and the separations that we have with one another, let alone versus the connection that we have with one another. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks for discussing that, Joe. It's good stuff. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was hoping you'd tell me. No. There's been a lot said. I just wanted to, we've discussed earlier the douloi, the monosoi, and aristoi, and idiotus is sort of orthogonal to those class things. People aren't idiotic because they're slavish or what was a good instrument, or use their reason instrumentally. Being idiotic is a scope problem that you narrow in on something and know. So yes, I suppose you don't normally see idiotic aristoi, only because to get to be an aristoi means you have to be able to take in the scope of the polis, at least for the Greeks. So it would be a very broad-minded idiot in that sense. And the other, that I think it was Olga, I don't know, at the very beginning, that her comments on evolution and life, that certainly I'm not going to claim that the Greeks had a theory of evolution. All you got to do is go to Aristotle and see that you have the fixed forms, the fixed species, the whatever that are eternal, that the medievals loved so much. But the Greeks did see life as agonistic, as there being a not just life, phusis, all nature is agonistic. And evolution, had they known that, well, there were these, how do you get something that metabolizes only inorganic compounds and therefore begins to have a life, these things that eat sulfur coming out of plumes on the ocean floor, or simple things that can do the minerals and stuff in seawater using the energy from light eaters. That's what it is. The energy source is photons. That's a very good title, by the way, Jenny. I think light eaters, that they eat light is food. It is a source of energy for them. It's for all plants, but that if you're not one of those kinds of creatures, or whatever we'd call them, that don't struggle against other living things or other natural forces, maybe they struggle against other natural forces, but other living things, it's certainly clear that like, one of our favorites there, Stephen Jay Gould, life evolved on the planet Earth. And he doesn't, and no individual species of any of the things above these bacteria can live independently. They all live in this thing. having to cooperate with and struggle against simultaneously. And we're not talking about political struggle. We're talking about the means of living. You know, you eat, well, and it's typically moderns would say you eat or be eaten. And maybe the more correct thing, which I think Olga hinted at, is you eat and be eaten. I kind of like that. But, you know, we can go ahead and talk about idiots forever, but there are other things here that we can talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, it's interesting how much, you know, and this is one of the big changes from early 20th century to early 21st century biological theory, is that we used to really emphasize, you know, the struggle for survival and the survival of the fittest, and the survival of the fittest was just a biological way of encoding our own political struggle to be number one. We're the winners and you're the losers, haha, was sort of the driving force of interpretation throughout the 19th century.
Right. I think this evolution view, as I understood what Olga said, is not about the fittest.
Right.
All eat and all are eaten.
Right.
It's not got anything to do with the fittest.
Right.
Oh, and I was thinking, I did once get to listen to a lecture by E.O. Wilson, the famous ant biologist. Yeah, and he had all these pictures of ants as not as slime mold ranchers of bacteria, but they were
aphids, right?
Aphids. They were cattle ranchers in a sense. They didn't eat the aphids, but they milked them, and they had these aphid farms where, and the ants would defend foes of the aphids, you know, against things, so the aphids could grow fat and drip this aphid honey and or whatever it was, this aphid fluid out of their abdomens, and the ants would just love it. And it was just, so this is, we talk about, you know, we domesticated cats and dogs, but this domestication strategy, sort of, or ranching strategy, is really something that it goes unthought, except by some specialists in the area. And it's a great metaphor or a great story to remember when you get some simple-minded view of evolution, or what kind of struggle is, or it's all struggle, no cooperation, or whatever.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, the more you know about evolution and biology and ecology, which are highly complex topics, the easier it becomes to spot an ideologue, because they come in and they've got some simple thought-turning cliche and they want to push it. It's all struggle and it's only struggle and there's nothing but struggle. And anybody who actually knows any biology or ecology or evolution laughs and laughs and laughs and says, wow, you have a less than childish view of a highly complex situation. You know, one of the things that is really interesting is if you spend a few weeks in your spare time Googling the evolution of vision in living things on the planet Earth, it's amazing how many separate times the eye has evolved from scratch. And we know it's from scratch because they're based on entirely different protein sequences. They're, you know, we can tell the ones that are related because they're working off the same proteins. And just based on that distinction, you can figure out, you know, which ones evolved separately from the line that led to ours. And I don't know, they figured out something like a dozen different lines of evolution in living beings from scratch for the creation of the eye. And that's amazing enough, you know, to get started. But where it really gets amazing is when you go the level below that. You say, well, let's talk about partial vision in single-celled organisms, right? So no eye is involved, right? We're talking about you are one cell, and that's all you got. And even they can and have developed the ability to respond to light. Single-celled organisms, there are lots of single-celled organisms, including some algae, which is bizarre, that respond to light and they move in either in pursuit of darkness or in pursuit of light or what have you. And you can learn how they do it, and it's very interesting what they're doing at a molecular level instead of at a cellular level. Yeah, but the ones that amaze me the most are the single-celled organisms that are mostly translucent, and they use their entire body like a lens. So their translucent globular body focuses the light that hits them to a spot on the inside of their own membrane that encloses them. And at that spot on the membrane, the right biomolecules react to the light. And that's how the single-celled organism knows which way the light's coming from. It's the opposite side of me from the one that's being activated. And so they can turn and follow the light or move away from it or what have you. No eye to be found anywhere, no optic nerve, nothing. None of that stuff that we think of as essential for vision. And yet they too have independently developed the ability, which of course they did billions of years before multicellular organisms existed at all. They developed the ability to respond to light, move around and do their things. The more you look at this stuff, the more you realize we are just living in a very, very, very big, complex universe. It's so big and complex that even people who say what I just said are grossly underestimating the scale of the size and complexity of it. Of course, we're idiots. We don't know most of this stuff, and we never will because we're not going to live long enough. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'm going to first have a very brief response to what Donald and Olga said, about everybody's eating each other. I wonder whether that's the true dialectic, because we all like banquets. But I don't think anybody dared to publish, you go to a banquet and you'll eat and be eaten. I don't know if very many people will show up at that banquet, even though that is really the true dialectic that we should understand actually is at work. But I want to get to my other point, which came up in terms of like the spirit as reaching to know something that's beyond its own earthly understanding. And it first reminded me of Plato's cave, not so much the divided line. He climbs out of the cave shadows to see the world as it is. But unfortunately, when you climb out of the cave to see the world as it is, you begin to eventually build a house. And you're going to equip the house with all sorts of things, pictures, and maybe some kind of computer, and you have the image of the world. And so therefore it becomes a synthetic construction of the world that you appear, but you construct it. And I wonder, I'm thinking about the movie. I can't seem to find it. I try to spend a couple of minutes trying to find it. A movie, I think it was acted by Jim Carrey. He was trapped in the world in which it was synthetic, constructed for him. If you guys remember that movie.
The Truman Show.
Truman Show, that's it. That's a Truman Show. It's like, have we constructed such a synthetic structure that we thought was transcendent, but in fact it's only virtual? that we are trapped in that world, and it's such a good life in a funny way if you never really question, like, oh wait a minute, this is not real, this is virtual. We're happy with it, and so the fact that he discovered he wants to like go out to see what the world really was when he climbed out of the cave, but it turned out he enclosed himself in the own structure of itself. I mean, that seems like a very important moment when you realize, now, wait a minute, this is not the real world. Instead of like just being satisfied with the world that was, in a sense, maybe this struggle to go beyond the limitations of being is to be in the roof of the world. That's where the cosmos is. To stand on the roof of the world rather than being in the world. Do we really want to stand on the roof of the world? Can we stand on the roof of the world? I mean, maybe we contradict ourselves because we do have things that go out into space. Is that the roof of the world? I don't know. I mean, it's like, so maybe there are those people who want to traverse and live on Mars, or live on, Alpha Centauri, like they're the one that wants to really access the true forms as it was. I don't know. It just seems to me you have to make a choice whether you're gonna live in the world, but then you have the other problem, which is that you synthesize the world and construct a virtual reality that supposedly you should be perfectly comfortable with, but it didn't turn out quite as good as Jim Carrey's movie, The Truman Show, because he was perfectly happy in that show. But it seems to me when you're dealing with virtual world, a lot of people are very, very anxious. I mean, they're not happy at all. So how does that work? How does the synthetic world compare to the real world? It's not that we don't have anxiety in the real world as well. Like I said, we might be invited to a the truly dialectical banquet, and we want to avoid. Maybe until the end of life, we might be willing to do that. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. See, now that phrase is going to get stuck in my head. It's like I want to be invited to a banquet, but I don't necessarily want to be invited to a dialectical banquet. It's like I was hoping to be the eater and not be one of the eatees. but so Hayao Miyazaki, my favorite animator, Japanese animator, has all these great animated films out. But for one of his first ones that he did as director, not the very first, but one of the first, Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind, to promote the film, he simultaneously worked on a manga, a Japanese comic of the film. And after a certain point, they branched, and the film had to wrap up and come to an end, and the manga kept going. And the manga became this giant science fiction story that really dwarfs even Dune in terms of its scale of exploring kind of the future of human beings and ecologies and so forth. And that phrase, eating and being eaten, is a major theme that runs throughout that manga. He really wrestles with the complex ecology. What does it mean if humanity's been displaced from being at the top of the food chain? And not displaced because we were outcompeted, but displaced because the consequences of our own actions knocked us out of first place and caused the creation of this poisonous world forest. That is the thing they're struggling with in the film and in the manga. And
there was a Twilight Zone episode that about some aliens coming to the planet and
yes, to serve man.
To serve man, right? And it's like that scientists try to crack the code, and they got to serve man. It sounds good to really be service to man. Like they're just good people, and a bunch of people start taking off of the, with them, because they're good people, and the scientists finally crack the subtitle. It's a cookbook. It's a cookbook.
Run for your lives.
Too late, though. Too late.
Yes. Thanks, Phil. George, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, you said something. Okay, going back to the idea of, I'm going to use the word idiot. And what's the elevation, right? In that, it's interesting because I'll start off at this point. I teach environmental politics classes, and students more than once have brought up the Greek definition of idiot to explain our treatment of the environment. Now, you mentioned the idea that moderns think that there are no problems to solve, this and that, but I mean, I would submit to you that is the key politics of modernism, right? And I put a quote from Karl Marx in the chat. Contempt for theory, art, history, and for man as an end in himself is the real conscious standpoint, the virtue of the man of money, right? So this idea that all there is idiots, money, pleasure, hedonistic pleasure, right? There's no higher elevation to humans, right? And so, I mean, one way, I mean, it's quite literal, right? With global warming denialism. I mean, you're literally imposing idiotism on people, right? You're not letting them you're trying to prevent them from understanding even how the ecology operates. And so someone talked about inequality. And, I think for, certain for Marx and for the ancient Greeks, inequality per se is not the problem. The problem is that when the wealthy, in order to keep their position, seek to impose idiocy on people. So you mentioned STEM. And indeed, I think in philosophy, I mean, I look at analytic philosophers. And in my opinion, they're imposing idiocy because all they're saying is all there is matter and energy. All there is science. That's the only thing that passes for knowledge. That's idiocy. Because in the ancient Greek notion of it, because that's I frequently say almost the least important knowledge we have is that of matter and energy. It's being authentic. It's developing that broader perspective. I'm sorry, I don't know the Greek word. That broader perspective that allows you to see the world, right? And ideally, it is science then that fits into that broader perspective. Science is not an end in and of itself. Science is a way to make the world better, to gain an understanding of the world broadly, and to make it better. So to the extent that we see in education the trend to say, oh, just learn STEM, just learn STEM. That is an effort to impose idiocy. I'll also note very quickly that there was the notion of universal higher education, right? I mean, of course, we know that for many centuries, only the elites were given knowledge of the whole, right? University education used to be ancient Greek, really the basic classical ancient Greek, to understand the whole. And the masses were, again, kept in ignorance, including illiteracy. In the late 19th century, when it was determined that in order for the economy to function more effectively, workers had to gain more technical knowledge. And so this is where we get the A&M colleges, the agricultural and mechanics, or the agricultural and the military schools. Because the idea was, we're just going to teach workers how to operate the machines, and that's it. Well, there was a major struggle. Workers responded against this and rejected this argument. And someone famously said, in my mind, said, basically what he said, the capitalists want us to genuflect and simply work on their machines. That's their vision of university education, right? And so, I just object to this idea that you say, modern just takes man as is. That's not modern. That's a very reactionary conservative politics, meant quite literally to enslave us. So we're, broadly speaking, the masses. So we're enslaved by being kept as idiots, only thinking about food, only thinking about water, only thinking about sex, right? So, I mean, this is really, the Greeks really did have it, really understood the issue quite well in terms of, again, I go back to this is what divides the civilized from the idiot, or the barbarian and the idiot. The elite, and mind you, our elites, I hate to say it, are just as deeply as idiots, right? In the Greek sense, we see Donald Trump. We see, again, the attitude towards global warming. They themselves have been consumed by their own idiocy. Again, we're using these Greek concepts. But again, going back to this, they want to be elevated. They want to see the world, and they want people to be dominated simply by their emotions, etc., and so forth. They want the broad masses just to be idiots. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, there's the issues of it's one of the places where Marx is strong is on issues of false consciousness, on how easy it is to get people to have a misunderstanding of themselves and the world that's so profound that they act against their own self-interests. This is more early Marx than later Marx. Capital doesn't talk about this as much, but this issue of false consciousness is really critically important because if it is that easy to get people to dislodged from a clear appreciation of who they are, how the world works, and what they need that relationship to be, it raises deep fundamental questions that go far beyond, the class struggle and things like that. They go right to the heart of our basic theories of politics and economics and so forth, all of which are based on the assumption that we mostly see things the way they are. Most of us, most of the time, see mostly how things are. And if that's not true, if most of the time we are in a state of false consciousness, at least partially, in which we don't have a strong grasp on our, what matters to us, then we have a deep fundamental problem because none of our institutions are prepared to handle that.
Well, what I
you
would
keep
say
on-
as a response to that is that, and I think what you're missing there is that there is a political struggle on this, right? There is a political struggle. There are reactionary elements that want to prevent us. I mean, it really goes even to Marx and Hegel are really, I've come to learn, they're virtually synonymous with each other. Hegel said, of course, that the evolving of the human collectively and individually is to know the whole. And so there are forces willing to use almost any means necessary, not almost, really use any means necessary to prevent people from seeing the whole. They want to keep us narrow, right? And so my point to you is that, without getting too far along into this, is that and this is what Marx basically says. This is Marx's contribution, basically. Hegel thought it was just an organic process, and that really Hegel presents it more like you do, which is, people just have to smarten up. And it just has to be it's a process more individual. Now then, as enough individuals smarten up on their own, then we have a collective shift. What Marx said was, no, that there is an actual politics at play, that there are people that are trying, the powerful, many of the powerful, most of the powerful, all the powerful, they're trying to keep the public in the dark. And so there are elements of the working class, etc., that are trying to enlighten, hence the notion of enlighten. In that context, for me, Marx and Hegel are the quintessential Enlightenment thinkers. So that's the only thing I'd add to you, that there is, again, not that you have to accept it, but that there is an institutional struggle over this question of idiocy versus, and I think this is really what the Greeks were speaking to, enlightenment. Enlightenment. I use that phrase, enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, you'll find that of course, our project here isn't to describe the world the way it is, right? Because we could argue about that all day long, and ultimately, none of us is in a position of a god able to see the whole picture and then just declaim to the rest of the mortals what's really going on. We're all some flavor of idiot, struggling with partial knowledge and a limited perspective. To the Greeks, in particular, this is important because the purpose of this book, Millennia and Microcosm, is to learn to see through these three different lenses. And that means being able to put aside modernist, even Marxist perspectives temporarily, not to lose them, but to be able to take them off, put them on a shelf, and pick up and put back on the ancient perspective and ask ourselves, what would Socrates see here that a modern, whether it's a capitalist or whether it's Stalin or anybody else, would be unable to see because of the modern worldview. This entire project is based on the idea of learning. We're not struggling to find the one true worldview and say, well, this is what's really going on. So we start by acknowledging none of us is ever going to have that perspective. What we're looking for is we're trying to gain proficiency in the ability to disentangle ourselves from the worldview that we were born into and trapped by up until the point where we learn to start to be able to put on these alternatives. So the ancient perspective predates Marxism, predates Hegel, predates all of those things. This discussion of the nature of man as having idiocy built right into it structurally as a feature. And that feature is both a gift and a curse, because it allows us to be creative and look at something other than what we actually need to do for our survival, but it also means that we lose track of what we need to do for our survival and endanger it frequently.
But let me say this, and I respond really quickly, because you said something that I think is important that needs to be raised, which is that, again, and we see this in the, first and foremost, what I'm going to say is that, I guess what I respond to initially is your claims about the way modern man is. So again, I'm responding to that, and part of that empirical claim of what you're saying. So it's not to say that you're wrong, but I think that requires some unpacking when you say that. The other point I'm going to say is, and this is very relevant, which is that for the Greeks, right, if I understand this correctly, it's not simply that man overcomes his idiocy, but that the city-state, right, institutions the Lyceum, it helps us to overcome our idiocy. In other words, it's not simply a personal journey, right? This is about how our institutions and their institutions should be, or why do we have institutions of higher learning, right? Why do we have the city state? It goes to the core of that. Yes, there's an economic advantage. Presumably, there's some military and political advantage, but the city state is more than that. It's an institution that brings us together, that allows us to grow, to overcome our idiocy, right? So the purpose of institutions ideally is to make us more authentic, to make us more fully developed as civilized individuals, etc., and so forth. And what I'm simply saying, in apart from taking up your question of moderns think this or moderns think that, my point is to simply say that, judging it from the Greek perspective, right, we can assess and engage our institutions, evaluate them, right? Are our institutions really geared towards elevating us, or are they failing and indeed reinforcing the idiocy? Which, I mean, we're not tabula rasa, right? But we're born as little kids and we're born as egos, right? So part of that maturation process is, again, becoming elevated. But again, institutions are supposed to help elevate us, right? So that we cannot really separate ourselves from the institutions that seek to shape us, right? Just like we kind of the ancient Greece. If you separate yourself from the city state, that you're dead, essentially. So it's more than just individual discovery, right? It is a politics of the way we assess our institutions, and in this way, the ancients are extremely helpful, I submit, in allowing us to assess our institutions. So, I'm saying I'm not trying to send the argument in a different direction. What I'm simply saying is that the ancients really are the starting point for the question of whether institutions are civilizing or whether they're not. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I'm going to call on Olga in a second. Before I do, I'm gonna pick up on something Sharon alluded to by waving around the printout of the chapter, and that's that, for purposes of this book, we can see that Kenneth Smith is directly addressing this question. He's setting up the framework. This entire section, Character and Class, section G in chapter 4, is about these questions. So we'll explore that more directly. As far as characterizing modernity, I'm not going to try hard to characterize modernity until we finish the medieval section, which comes after the ancient section, because the final section of the book is focused on modernity. And at that point, we'll be able to examine modernity from not only whatever perspectives we happen to bring, that we grew up with and learned about, but also from the perspective of the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. At that point, we'll be armed with all three and be able to turn and look at modernity. I think we'll get a rich discussion out of that, but that's months away. So for now, we'll stay focused on the Greeks. This opening sentence, the Greeks deem anyone self-absorbed in his own private concerns and self-interest, an idiotes, for whom the larger worlds of nature and culture do not count, to be the human type closest to the animal. But even the animal has its instinctively programmed course of maturation. So they're talking, he's talking here about the Greeks having a perspective that we need multiple perspectives, whether from of the other individuals who make up our culture, but also the institutions that we create, to supplement our own overly limited perspective, to have any chance to teach us to engage in the struggle to get out of our own limited perspective. You can put somebody in an institution of higher learning, and they can still come out the other side of it entirely convinced of all their own prejudices when they went into it. The institutions can't force people. It takes a dialogue between the individual and the institution. In fact, to use Stephen's term, it takes a conflict, right? There's a Heraclitus would say there's a war, a palintropy, a dialectic between the responsibilities of the individual and the responsibilities of the institution when it comes to helping people rise up out of the innate idiocy that we're born into. It's neither one nor the other. It's a very difficult point to make in modernity, because we like simple answers that are yes or no or true or false. So we typically want to say either it's entirely the individual who must struggle and the institution some sort of vague ephemera that's not relevant, and that's one political position. Or we go the other extreme and say the individual doesn't matter, only the institutions matter, and individuals are just pawns of institutions. And both of these are deeply modern, deeply non-Greek perspectives. And the way you know that is there's no dialectic involved. The Greeks would immediately harness this into a polyntropy and say, well, why would it be one or the other? Most things are not. It's the struggle and the dialogue and the tension between what the individual is trying to achieve for themselves based on their current character and what the institutions and culture and so forth are trying to mold the individual into. And neither of them is the winner or the primary source or the only source. There's a struggle between the two. And that's the human condition, that we are caught up in that polyntropy. It's both in a paradoxical form. At least that's the Greek perspective. I'm not saying that's true. That would be the ancient Greek perspective. Olga, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, first, sorry that I don't turn on my video because my computer could just shut down. And I'm sorry, it's already kind of, I wanted to respond to Donald comments on what I said, and it's kind of it's eaten or eaten, and but maybe better to say eat and provide something for as a food for the system, that system could balance itself and exist. For example, it's very easy right now. We all right now eaten by bacteria. It's you can Google and you find out that from 2 to 6 pounds in our body is bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms, and we have to maintain their health or we get sick, and it's everywhere. And but what is interesting, I see that these people here have different agenda and coming here for different reasons. My agenda is that I am interested in finding out when we're starting to withdraw with this circle of things that kind of balance the system and try to disbalance it because this, let's say, natural struggle is very hard. And we want to kind of, again, we want to withdraw from it. And then probably we started to create this notion of civilization, that we are better, we are smarter, we're more civilized, and there are probably idiots who live on the lower, on the lower level, and we have to educate them. So that's probably and it started earlier than Greeks, of course. You see, it's in Babylon and everywhere, what we know, of course, but how it was started for me, it's interesting, and how people, and that's probably distinction between civilization. And it's not only we kind of right now eaten by bacteria, we have to provide it, we have to invest it in nature, but now we don't do this. Our it helps to digest us, but then we don't invest it again and put in the ground as it should be. You see that, and it's one of the reasons that we absolutely are already separated by civilization. And civilization was like this notion was started to be created that separate us, not include us, but separate us, make us better and smarter, and our institutions also better and smarter, and so on. So that's what I'm interested where it started and how it's progressed. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Olga. That's very thoughtful. Yeah, these are, you're completely, Kenneth would completely agree with you that, these kinds of concerns that we're talking about in this chapter definitely didn't start with the Greeks. You're right. It's much older than that. One of the things we've said in some of the past seminars, but it's worth repeating in this one, is that the reason we study the Greeks is not because we hold them up as an ideal that we all want to be like. We study the Greeks because they obsessively wrote everything down. So, when they went through the transition from their earlier mythos culture to their later logos culture, they wrote right through that transition, and hardly any other cultures did. Most cultures are on one side or the other of that line. So when they're writing, we can't see how the one developed out of the other. But because the Greeks wrote right through it, we're able to go back and see how their perspective changed as they left behind the more religious, mythological perspective on the world and shifted increasingly to a more pragmatic, political view of the world. Can see how did they rationalize it, what motivated them. It's frustrating that we don't have that kind of literature for the Aztecs or for the Tang dynasty, or some of the most early Chinese dynasties. We just have to look at them afterwards and try to guess about how they got that way. But in the case of the Greeks, at least part of their transformation, we can actually read about it and argue about it. So that's kind of what we're doing here in this.
Just one short note. I read and once I also participated in some group who discussed Greek philosophy and Greeks and their civilization. For example, some was saying that yes, they have democracy, but what they vote for mostly, they vote for war. They vote how to destroy surrounding idiots and make them civilized. You see, so it's we could. It's very difficult to say. Is it something what our civilization has started is something that is really positive, or it's probably the root of the all negative things that we have now.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, I agree. Great comment. It's part of why I love reading the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. And I'm going to reread it this year. It's been too long, but because, he's really writing about the way that they voted for and talked themselves into a giant war that destroyed Greece, even though their biggest nightmare was civil war and destroying Greece. They had their big national epic, the Iliad, is about how they how their ancestors wrecked everything through their virtues. And they're like, well, let's learn from our ancestors. The one thing we're absolutely not going to do is engage in a giant civil war that wrecks Greece. And then what did they do? Well, they engaged in a giant civil war that wrecked Greece. And when you know that that's what they were terrified of, and you read the way that Thucydides describes the course of the war, you really notice the times when he's being ironic, when he's going, dear God, how did it come to this? Here we are doing exactly what we said we would never, ever do. It's fascinating reading. Anyway, thank you for your comments, Olga. I'm going to call on Phil. Come off mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, it's getting really complicated in a way, because the problem with, in a sense, understanding the whole is that I think human beings are limited, by and large, to the relationship of the singularity to the constellation of possibilities, and that's the whole. And that relationship is really the relationship between correspondence and coherence. Because correspondence, you could say, oh yeah, that tree looks like a tree, I understand that concept, no problem. That's an apple tree, I understand that concept. But how does it fit into a total circle of understanding, which is the greater being rather than the being of the individual thing? That's a much more complex thing. And not only that, and I agree with George that a civilization is very important in that, at least in that part of it. And the problem is, there's also the concept of thrownness. We're thrown into a world that we had no choice to begin with. We're thrown into it. We have to deal with that constellation of understanding and that structure, and we have to, in many ways, suffer through that structure. So we're thrown into a world in which the educational system is divided. They don't want to totally educate everybody. You know, I truly believe in a liberal education. You know, I think if we could afford to do so and have the courage to construct a society that would do so, everybody would have the chance to learn about nothing specifically productive importance and then branch into something that they want to do, you know, into maybe a much more mechanical process. But unfortunately, we're thrown in the world where by and large, we don't want to do that. You know, the rich people want the liberal education to be truly a human being. Uh, the poor people, yeah, we just want them to be productive individuals, and that's enough. They deserve that because we need them to do that. So right away, you know, if you're thrown into the thing and you're a poor individual, then you kind of got a problem. Not that you couldn't become educated and civilized at all, but it's just harder. You know, like I say, you live in a neighborhood and people are struggling, and there's possibly a lot of violence. You're going to grow up to be a different individual than if everybody is very polite and have a lot of etiquette and all that. It's just different. You're a different person. So it structures society to continue that way. And it seems to me, and I want to, the part I kind of disagree what uh, George was saying, yeah, was that yeah, I myself am totally for green energy. There's no question about it. But we're throwing in the world in which that is at least partially impossible because it's based on the region. For instance, Peter Zion pointed out that green energy in California, well, solar panel in California, and let's say Colorado, Texas, that's all good because the sun shines there, right? Solar panels in Germany is idiotic because the sun don't shine enough for the do. And if you put solar panels in Germany and other places that don't have a lot of sun, then what's going to happen is at least the technology we have at the moment is actually not only not productive in terms of efficiency, but in some sense, the upfront cost, in a sense, of getting the material to produce very little energy in relationship to that, it's actually causing more carbon footprint than what you will save at the end. So therefore, in a sense, to try to be green in those places in which there's no sun in terms of solar panels, it's actually producing more carbon than if you just didn't do in a different way. And so where there's no wind, you can't have windmills. You know, you have to find places where the wind actually blows and blows pretty hard, at least intermittently. So you have to create the resources. The problem is that then that's going to take resource, which, by the way, is an exploitative process. And he points out that in order to do so, we would need 3 times as much copper that's being mined and ored. And that's impossible. It's never been done that way. We're exhausting. In order to get the copper, we have to go deeper and deeper on Earth to get it. So you have a kind of material limitations. So you have to spot where the green culture works in a specific way. In other ways, you have to have different strategies. And so the problem is once you have that, you have the problem of distribution. You know, how do you then get the sunshine states to transport the electricity to other non-sunshine states? So those are very detail oriented that you have to say. You just can't say green, that's all there is to it. And so it's, yeah, you could support that, but you have to see the details. And once you see the details, then you know how to spot the relationship of where it should go. You know, you live in Australia, solar panels are terrific. I mean, there's sunshine all the time, you know, in fact, too much sunshine. But you know, you live in like a rainy state that does, and the wind doesn't blow, and none of it's going to work. You have to do something else. So just be careful how you map out this relationship with the resources and the productive. He said, of course, we could advance in the technology, and someday we'll find some other way of doing it that doesn't depend on so much lithium and and copper and all that kind of stuff, and that might work even in a dimmed down state, dimmed down country. So just be very careful where you put the specificity of the situation. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Just going to bring up the issue of the child's creche. That the institution, I was working as a shop steward, one workplace, and I remember the boss, Mark. He says, the trouble with you guys is you're all too institutionalized. Occasionally somebody says something which has some value, and I thought in that case, Mark, he said one which I've got a note, and it's this tendency. Children live in creches. We've created these creches called schools, and they found that they couldn't get outside the creche, so we created universities. And there's a lot of people that have never left the creche and gone outside that system and discovered that there's a struggle and a set of rules that they haven't learned in the creche. And that's actually the role of intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to go outside your ken and pick up a new set of values that work. And also, classically, you have the story of the Spartan warrior. He's brought up inside the gymnasium. Then one day he's thrown out into the wilderness with his loincloth and a small stick to fight off the wolves. We've shown you a few of the tricks in the gymnasium. It's all very institutionalized. Now you're getting tossed out and you have to survive by your own wits. How much of that is in the modern world anymore? Oh, this is like the science fiction author Robert Heinlein. There was a point, the school kids thrown out like the Spartan warrior to fight in space to struggle against things. So if people remain forever inside a creche, they don't mature. They don't grow beyond the childish state. It's only when you face a struggle which is outside the rules. Now, a classic example is the Arthurian tales. You have all the knights. They're all pretty smart in Camelot. Lancelot's at the top. And then they have to go outside of Camelot to find the Grail. 99 out of 100 screw up. Oddly enough, the guy who was the very dumbest one in Camelot, Sir Percival the Stupid, is actually the one that makes it through because he's actually a little bit cautious. He's actually humble. He realizes I don't know everything. You get Sir Lancelot, top of the tree. He's outside of Camelot. He comes across the evil temptress in the little hut in the glade. He's gone.
Totally falls for it.
Poor, it's a bit like that, one of those films where, Sir Percival's just going through the landscape and there's just dead knights everywhere. What works well in the creche in Camelot? There were a few lessons there, sure, but now you're having the real story outside the creche. But today we are dominated by creche thinkers. We have professional politicians. You go to school, go to university, become a professional politician, work for a politician straight away to go up through the ranks, and they don't understand a single person outside that milieu, It's It's a tragedy today. This is what Kenneth Smith was pointing out. This is what he started off with, that we are facing a tragedy because we've failed to heed some of these ancient lessons. We're making mistakes that they overcame in the past because we've lost the understanding. But yeah, that's that thing. It's the kid's crash. It works for a while, but one day you're going to jump outside the nest and you better watch out. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that goes right to the heart of this issue that the Greeks have about the relationship between the one and the many, the individual and the institutions or the creches, which is that neither one is the answer. You can't say it's all the individual, but you also can't say it's all the institutions or the creches. You have to be able to be pushing on both fronts, and you have to engage in the uncomfortable tug of war and the tensions between the two, or else you're never going to get anywhere. You know, it's one dude isn't ever going to build a pyramid. That takes a society. But likewise, a society full of people who are infantilized and pacified and only exist within the matrix of, you know, the institutions, these are people who can't deal with change. And when change comes, they're useless. They haven't been prepared for it. Excalibur, I think, is the film you were thinking of, where he's walking through the landscape and there's dead knights everywhere, and he's like, this is like a horror story. All these people who were the best and the brightest, now they're just features of the landscape, their bodies, instead of, you know, the glorious people they once were. And I think your take on that's really interesting, which is that it's because they had become so institutionalized that they were not prepared at all for what was outside. You know, the stories of Percival are so interesting because, and he was superseded, right? Later, the Arthurian cycles push him to the side and make Galahad, the pure, perfect, godly one, becomes the hero. But the earlier one has some wisdom, which is, no, it's the kid who knows he doesn't know everything, right? He knows everybody else knows things he doesn't know. He knows he has to stay on his toes. And he grew up in the woods where, you know, he wasn't in the creche. He had to learn how to survive, and all the things he knows how to do are viewed with contempt when he gets to Camelot, right? Oh, that's the stupid farmer woodsman stuff. That's of no use whatsoever. But then when they all have to go out into the woods and look for the grail, he's the only one that survives and finds it. He's the only one who's got the skills to do it. It's an interesting take, Stephen. I like that. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I'd like to take us back to the text there, because the general discussion is about what it takes for the individual to mature, the internal forces, the external forces. And I think the next couple of sentences in the following paragraph kind of exemplifies that. So may I read for a bit?
Yeah, please do.
It says, what the Greeks grasped is a severe insight that Christian and modern cultures cannot bear to confront. If there can be for humans such an accomplishment as self-mastery, then so also must there be such a liability as self-slavery. We talked about mental slavery, and none but us can free our minds, right? Any human being has the perverse potential to set his face impiously against all the tasks of natural, psychic, and rational maturation, against the task of learning to swim in the flow of the life. And he talked about, and the next sentence illustrates what Stephen just said about the creche. Although others, parents, teachers, exemplars, can describe the conflicts and illustrate some solutions, no one can muster the inward resources or resolve the issues in higher perspectives but oneself. So again, it's an internal process balancing external forces if we want to achieve the arete.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for reading that, Sharon. I mean, yeah, that takes us right to the point, doesn't it? This is the struggle, right? The Greeks are very clear on the one hand that you can't produce Aristoi if you don't have a culture that cultivates Aristoi. You need to have that help, because it's even though we've evolved into a species that only comes into its full maturity after it goes through that process. Nevertheless, that process is still difficult and contranatural. It's like giving birth again or being born again. It's a struggle to get to that condition, and you need the midwives of your culture to help you along. And I think it's in one of the parables and otherwise when he's talking about the Sphinx helping people to be born into a new level of mentality, that you need the wise midwife there to help turn the head just so during the process of birth to get through the canal. So this is kind of his metaphor that he says the way that the Greeks see the cultivation of Aristoi is anthropoculture. It takes a village. And yet, at the exact same time that that's true, it's also true that people are not a tabula rasa, and you can't just make them into Aristoi. You can't make people into anything. You can't make somebody into, the greatest classical composer of all time. He's got to have it in his nature to want to do that and need to do it. He has to be driven, and that's going to come from within. So the culture can offer opportunities and examples and help, but it can't stamp people out like mass production. You have to, what the culture has to do is pay close attention to who the person is growing into becoming anyway, and help them in the direction that they're trying to go. And if some of them are never going to grow up to have a mature adult mind, well, then you help them to grow into whatever it is that they're going to grow into. But if they do have the potential, then you try to help them grow into that. So on the one hand, that's the duties and responsibilities and role of the group or the whole or the culture. But at the same time, these kinds of developments only happen if the individual is willing to engage in that struggle, if they're interested, if they're aware, if they have a need to overcome the things they have to overcome on that journey, towards enlightenment. So this is kind of what he's talking about with this group of sentences. He's talking about here. George, we covered this a couple of months ago, and so the text is going to look a little one-sided here because he's already covered the other half, but he's already acknowledged the part that you need the culture to help cultivate you. So now here he's turning to the other half of the dialectic. He's not saying that the other half isn't true. He's saying that in addition to what was said before, we also have this issue that you're also not going to become an Aristos unless you need to overcome your self-slavery, unless you are driven to struggle. And the reason that you need that is that your brain is so clever. It is relentlessly all the time looking for ways to trap itself in one of the two easy modes of the mind, to fall back on what's comfortable, what's familiar, thought terminating cliches, the nostrums of based on our parochial experience and so forth. It's always, Mephistopheles isn't some external demon or devil who's trying to tempt us to hell. It is our own nature that's constantly tempting us to you don't have to work so hard. Hey, just give in. If you like it, it's probably good for you. There's all these little whispers in our brain that's kind of encouraging us to just relax and let go and go with the flow. After all, you don't want to get in trouble. You don't want to rock the boat. What if somebody doesn't like what you say? What if somebody doesn't like what you do? There's all this pushback, and it would just be easier to let go and be passive and not develop the mature adult human mind. And so the only people who are going to do it are the ones who really need it, who that's in their character, that they are driven to engage in that uncomfortable struggle for their entire lives. It's like Sisyphus, right? To two of the three character types that the Greeks acknowledge, Sisyphus must be in Hades and he must be being punished for something, because what moron would spend eternity trying to push a boulder uphill? That's hard. And if it's hard, you shouldn't do it. Only Sisyphus and Aristos sees pushing the boulder uphill for eternity as a reward. It is how you overcome the gravity trap of your own more naive nature to try to rise up to something higher. You do it by struggling for your entire life. You have to want to do it, or you'll just give up and let the boulder roll back down. So this is why he's talking about self-mastery and self-slavery here. Is, are you embracing enslaving yourself to your desires and your ideologies, or are you struggling against those gravity pulls to try to self-master yourself, master your appetites, master your ideologies, and so on? Go ahead, Sharon.
No, I was just agreeing. Yes.
Okay. So yeah, this is the stuff. And you know, to the Greeks, this is the hardest thing and the most important thing, that you need to create a culture that makes it possible to cultivate people, that makes it possible to both cultivate people in such a way that they self-cultivate themselves into developing their gifts, their arites. And if you do that, then your culture will produce a wealth of art and literature and, you know, building of buildings and you know, all the things that a culture needs to do to survive, that will naturally follow from, you know, creating that environment that's nurturing for people to engage in these struggles. But if your culture instead says, you know, other people can work on that stuff, but I think I could make more money if I just try to con some of these people. You know, while they're busy looking the other way, maybe I can pick their pocket. And you know, actually it's easier to pick their pocket if they're stupider. Maybe I can just go in there and change the curriculum of the educational system, and we'll just remove that stuff about teaching people about how to recognize a con artist and how to recognize if they're being conned. We just won't teach them that part. And we'll tell them that everything is great and they should trust everybody and everything will always be good. And you know, those people will then become my fodder. Those are the people that I'll then go after, and I'll try to con them out of what they've got. And that'll be easier than it would have been to try to con all those, you know, sophisticated heuristic types who are always on the lookout for people like me. So there is this way in which the Greeks thought, if you allow a significant percentage of your political economy to be given over to con men, you're going to fail as a civilization. Because even if you put everything towards trying to help people develop that level of self-scrutiny that's required to create a going civilization, you're still going to fail a significant amount of the time.
Yes.
So why would you stack the deck against yourself by saying, you know what, let's not try that hard. Let's spend our time ripping each other off instead. And that's a civilization that has no future. That's what the Greeks would have said. And they did. So this is what he's talking about here. So thank you for quoting this.
Can I say one more thing? Because
Please.
I have a question now. So I have one last sentence. It says, the Greeks see the mass of human lives becalmed in complacency and obtuseness, wistly losing the inward war against pathos because they have neither strategy nor discipline to defeat that vicious state. So there's something I think Donald said a couple of weeks ago where he talked about Plato's Republic. Am I talking about that right? Am I mentioning that right? So I started reading it as they tried to define what a just society is and the structure of a society. And I didn't get the impression that it was homogeneously constructive, that there were some, like when they tried to set up the family and the fellowship with the way they had the children. I thought that was kind of interesting. That was just book 5, you know, I'm looking through it. So while the Greeks here are talking about arete and excellence, I wonder if they had their own periods of, I don't want to say deviancy, but times when they were not excellent.
That's right. That's right. You know, it's at all times when people like Plato or Aristotle or Heraclitus are talking about the way things should be, they're not just engaging in idle speculation. They're criticizing the way things are. They're saying the way things are sucks. We are not living up to our own ideals. They're saying we have these ideals about what we're supposed to be doing and how we're supposed to structure society and how we're supposed to struggle against our own gravity wells. And yet when we look around ourselves at the Greek world, we see ourselves failing over and over to do those things. Thucydides does it a lot in the Peloponnesian War, which is why I like it so much.
Okay.
And so yeah, you're right. There basically was never a utopian period where the Greeks were living up to their ideals, but that didn't stop them from critiquing themselves in writing in light of the ideals that they thought they were supposed to be living up to. So this is kind of what we're wrestling with in this stuff. Yeah. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Sharon read the sentence that I had a little note by. And I don't want to have to remember it till next week. You know, if there's someone who has self-mastery, then there's someone who would have self-slavery. That's the key right there to that M. Night Shyamalan. I forget. Shyamalan. I can say it, but I'm having trouble here. Shyamalan, whatever he says. Anyway, where he's got the guy that always breaks the bones. So he starts reading the newspapers, looking for the guy that is invincible. It works. It's just the flip of this. And I just wondered, I'd like to know when Kenneth wrote this. Was he thinking about something like that?
Well, that film had already come out by the time he wrote this, no question.
Yeah. And the other thing, kind of a bit off, I very much like it when Phil talks about thrownness. And the other thing is when we talk about institutions that enslave. Well, there wasn't Athens High School. None of these guys went to Athens High School, and then they didn't graduate and go on to Athens U or even Athens A&M. There was no public school system in ancient Greece. Okay. And if we skip down a couple of paragraphs, you see the kind of things I think comes from Hannah Arendt, where of, you know, the oikos, the agora, and then the polis. That's where you get, and the thing is, the reason I like this is because this is when Arendt talks about this, she's talking about you ought not to throw people into the world, into your oikos, if you're not prepared to introduce them to it. It's the family in the oikos that prepares their members to go out into the world, not figuratively, into the agora, where they're going to deal with other people for the first time. And then as they mature, are going to take a position of a citizen within the polis. And so, you know, they got all this done without Athens A&M. It's just mind-boggling that they were able to do such a thing. You know, we can't do it even with all these institutions that help us. Or maybe they're not helping. One of those conclusions might be true.
Thank you, Donald. Yes. I mean, this is what we're really examining in these paragraphs here. Is he's setting us up to look at the fundamental dialectic of the way that the Greeks see the struggle between the responsibilities of the community and the responsibility and its institutions, and the responsibilities of the individual, and that the way that that in a very contra-modern way, the Greeks are perfectly comfortable saying neither one is fully responsible and neither one has no responsibility, that they're both responsible at the same time for different parts of the same problem, and that the whole society should be concerned with anthropoculture, that we don't want to descend into being cyclopes, you know, whose only God is our stomach. You know, that's the great terror that the Greeks have, is of the dissolution of society to the point that it's every man for himself, because they know that leads to catastrophe. Every man for himself cultures are the ones that they believe they've conquered. And if they become an every man for himself culture, then they'll be conquered. They're a warrior group. This is how they see the world. So they're obsessed with how do we produce aristoi competent to, you know, to cultivate a healthy society that can be free. That's what their obsession is. And the structure of the society with its three domains, which he's alluding to here, and which, Donald, I'm sure you're right, he got that right out of the human condition. You know, he told me once that after the human condition, he was frustrated that she didn't go further. He said, you know, it's fascinating what she said, but he kept waiting for her to take to the next picture of, what are you saying about the modern world then? Do we or don't we comply with what the Greeks did? Is it good that we don't comply? Is it bad that we, what's your take? And Hannah Arendt would be silent and move on to her next book. And he's like, no, I want you to talk about those things. So he did, right? He started writing about that stuff.
Well, it is just seeing life. I mean, I'll have to say, Heidegger, Phil, with thrownness. And then you read Arendt, and she knows this stuff, and she makes it pretty clear. Thrownness is giving birth. It's having children. That is throwing people into the world. And the responsibilities of not, some zeitgeist or something. We threw them. They're our kids. We have to take responsibility. She's taken something very a kind of abstract dialectic of how being moves through history and says, this is us having children, introducing them to the world, something we at least were thrown into ourselves, got introduced to ourselves, partially are responsible for creating, and we have to pass that on. We have to prepare them. It's us. There's nobody else. What do you think? It's the man behind? Well, that's like what Huey Long used to, or not Huey. Was it? Yeah, it was Huey or Russell Long. Get my Longs mixed up. Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree. And is it the man behind the tree that's going to take responsibility for raising our children, solving these problems? No, it's us. Sorry.
There's a Heraclitus fragment about just what you were saying. Says, after birth, men wish to live and accept their dooms. Then they leave behind them children to become dooms in their turn. And it's talking about that propagation of the web of causality and the character is fate. So we're setting fates or dooms in motion by throwing children into the world. I know Mr. Thrownness himself, Heidegger, he knew his Heraclitus. He had what, 2 books on Heraclitus? I only have one of them, but so he knew this fragment. He was thinking about this fragment, and I know Arendt could have picked it up through those dialogues and that discussion with him. So this whole question then becomes, if there is a diversity of people with a diversity of interests and a diversity of skill levels, a diversity of artes, how do you make a working society that allows us to simultaneously move in our own directions that we're compelled to by our character, while also somehow moving in a direction as a society in the direction of greater health and vitality and away from self-destruction and extinction? This is the struggle that they see, and it's rife with paradoxes and palintropies and dialectics. But a big part of it is the one and the many, and how are you going to organize around diversity? George, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
You say that, I feel like I'm on a radio show. In any event.
I do.
Yeah, that's fine. I want to respond to something you said earlier about the notion that culture or institutions, right, they could fail to, in other words, yeah, of course, it's a dialectical process. It's a process. It's ontological. We engage institutions to get elevated, ideally. Institutions, ideally, should be elevating us. And of course, institutions can't elevate us really if we don't want to be elevated. But one point I want to make was that the Greeks, and this is clearly seen in Aristotle, in my opinion, understands that institutions can be corrupt, right? Hence the notion of monarchy versus tyranny, or aristocracy versus oligarchy, right? And so we're not only struggling to be elevated, we're struggling to shape the institutions in a way that ideally elevate us. And in the end, if we fail in this process, we become enslaved. Long and the short of it. I'm just going to say today, if we fail in this process, civilization is going to end. So again, just to say that all of this is extremely relevant and not ancient at all. In fact, it matter. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, and there's some dialectical feedback loops here, because if the stages of human development, doulos to benausos to aristos, if they see that as the aristos is the stage at which you finally become aware of and take an interest in and dedicate yourself to taking responsibility for your own bullshit, for your character, and cultivating it and changing the arc of your life in a healthier direction, then it naturally would follow, from the Greek perspective, ideologically, naturally, it would follow that who should be taking charge of the institutions and holding them accountable and cultivating them. I mean, if your character affects your choices in a kind of feedback loop, it is certainly also true that the institutions that are supposed to be cultivating people, they too are something that you should have as part of that feedback loop, that you should be cultivating your institutions and changing them. But the question becomes, who's competent to do that? So if you've got somebody who's not willing to take responsibility for their own bullshit, you certainly can't trust them to take responsibility for an institution's bullshit, right? I mean, they're just going to project their own bullshit onto the institution and try to make it fit their desires and their ideologies, instead of cultivating it for the good and the health of
Well, what I wanted to say is that in this context, courage takes on a different dimension, which is not simply courage to face the external enemy, but a willingness to die.
Yeah.
In order to overcome corrupt institutions.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right. And so again, you have to be courageous in every phase of your life.
Yeah.
In order to reach that level of, ideal authenticity, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And so does Kenneth. I mean, he talks, not in this book, but in conversations we've had with him, he talks about that stage in Greek culture when there was a fad for public suicide. And the reason to engage in public suicide was to prove your contempt for death and to say, I'm willing to die for my ideals. I am not afraid to die. And I'm concerned that too many of you around me are starting to be afraid to die. So I want to set a public example of what it is to live for something greater than your own life, to be willing to, even if it's only as an object lesson, if that's the object lesson we need for more of you to free yourselves from your terror of death, then I'm willing to kill myself to show you what it's like to hold death so lightly that I'll discard it even for this reason. My life.
That's very fascinating you say that, because what I'm going to say is that the tyrant, right? How does the tyrant rule? Through fear, through menacing, through threatening to kill you.
Right.
Right. And so an unwillingness to die is really a willingness to submit to tyranny.
That's right.
And a willingness to submit to corruption.
That's right.
So that way, it's very fascinating that even that became a challenge and an issue within society. The willingness to die, simply to die, to show, hey, I am willing to die in seeking to overcome a tyrant in order to have society elevated, broadly speaking. I'm willing to sacrifice myself, just even as a symbol, to say we must be willing to die in order to confront and overcome the tyrant. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Yeah, as part of the whole question of, where do new aristoi come from, they knew that there need to be, and Donald has quoted Kenneth as quoting Aristotle and others in saying that, part of the way that you develop new aristoi is by having the examples before them to see aristoi in action. Because a lot of it, from the perspective of a doulos or a benausos, an aristos is difficult to conceive of. Somebody who's willing to give themselves not for what they want or for what they've been trained to believe in, but for what's actually for the good of the whole. This is hard. It's hard for a doulos or a benausos to imagine. But if you can see it happening in front of you, then it shocks you awake and you realize that this thing you thought was impossible is not only possible, but actually exists. And that's something you could do. People talk a lot about the power of Jesus as being an example of somebody who's willing to sacrifice himself, for the greater good. And that the mere act of showing people that you can live your life that way, was revolutionary in that it affected, large numbers of people. Once they saw the example, they realized they could live that way too, that they could do that. But before
That's
they
the
saw the
martyr.
example, they were sure.
I'm so sorry. That's the martyr, right? That's the martyr.
Right.
I'm going to very quickly, as you mentioned this, you were talking before you mentioned Jesus. I thought about the Buddhist monks
Yes.
that self-immolate
Vietnam.
in Vietnam, and that still has an imprint globally.
Yeah. I mean, it's been, dear God, 60 years, right? 55, 60 years.
Yes.
And yet everybody knows those photos. Everybody's seen them. And there's still people who follow the example.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, that's the powerful thing of this is the powerful and dangerous thing about an Aristos, is that they're willing to convert their life into a lesson because they understand the power that can have over the imaginations of other people who witness it and go, oh, so that's possible then. I wonder if I want to do that, which is something they couldn't think before.
I have to say this because, again, just in the moment we're having this is the idea that you're willing to die to change the trajectory of the world, right? So you think the world is headed towards that cliff. I mean, I think this is, again, to put this in the broader context. And so you're saying, look, I am willing to die to show you the way, and you too must be willing to die in order to correct the state of affairs. Again, so in other words, it points to a notion of a broader. So in other words, we focus on these things is because it points to the broader operation of institutions in society, and it crystallizes it too. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, George. And it works just as well when it's not an example of being willing to die, but being willing to live for a principle. So, in the martial arts community, the traditional martial arts community around Okinawa, actually meeting and working with one of these very old Okinawan senseis is revolutionary for a martial artist. It's a completely different experience from, here in the States, you work with people who are trying to pay their bills and they're constantly adding new events that charge money. And here's another thing you can do. Maybe you can buy a t-shirt, or they're always focused on this stuff. And you actually meet one of these little old guys from Okinawa who's like 80 and has been doing this since he was a kid. And the way that they organize their lives around the perpetuation of the practice and the pursuit of excellence, any number of white American dudes, like Vietnam War and afterwards, who spent time in Okinawa, came out of that experience changed for the rest of their lives. Once they saw it and they experienced what it was like to be in the presence of those people and work with them, they're like, I want to be like that guy for the rest of my life. That's cooler than where I was going. The things that were my ideals, I feel like they're inferior, and I want to live for those higher ideals that I'm seeing, in front of me. So there's this thing in us. Clearly, there's this thing in us that goes way beyond politics or psychology, but all the way down to our biology. There is a desire to emulate something wonderful. Our mimesis isn't just monkey see, monkey do, but it's monkey see something amazing, monkey become obsessed with doing the amazing thing themselves, right?
I know I've been saying too much. I'm just going to simply make this point that I'm really dwelling and really moved by the idea that you talked about people committing suicide just to show that they're willing to do it. And I have to look into that because that's really a fascinating phenomenon.
Thank you, George.
Again, as an example, to set the example, look, we must be willing to die if we are going to live the good life.
Thank you, George. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, now I'm a little hesitant what to do because I want to address the issue of thrownness, but I'm also want to address the issue of willing to die.
Pick one. Who's thrown this?
I'll address the issue of willing to die first. I admire both Nelson Mandela and Stephen Biko during the apartheid crisis. They were both warriors in regard to injustice. Stephen Biko was in some ways even more radical than Nelson Mandela. He was always confronting the officers, and he was eventually confronting them in such a way that he was, through a series of beating, was beaten to death. And I asked a friend of mine who's African, he's Nigerian, but he was a Nigerian prince who immigrated to the United States. I asked him the question, like, why is it that Stephen Biko failed when Nelson Mandela succeeded? And he said Nelson Mandela succeeded probably because he saw humanity in a broader way. He put himself in prison because he was just as radical as Stephen Biko in his life. But he was put in prison, and two things happened. He became kind of friendly and related to the prison guards. And the other thing was, he put himself in a position where they were responsible for his life. And so the duality of that meant that he could sustain himself from inside the prison until finally the revolution matured and he was released. Whereas Stephen Biko confronted the injustice so harsh that he never got a chance to make them responsible for his life. And so that is an understanding of your enemy and their responsibility, even in the most limited way, that was important. And I'm thankful that Nelson Mandela was also beaten to death as well, because he succeeded not as just a martyr, as a symbol that burned himself alive, but he succeeded in liberating the structure and had a chance to continue the restructure the post-apartheid world. And I think that's kind of important to understand, how you need to also understand at least the limited humanity of your enemies in order to be able to continue your work. Because if we're all willing to die for the cause without thinking through that, then apartheid might still be. So that was something I think was important to see. And that's why I really hold Nelson Mandela in the highest regard. And he, afterward, not only succeeded in being just as apartheid, but he actually tried to unify the blacks and whites as best as he could, given the intense fragmentation that was the case. And so that's that. Now, if you want me to go into thrownness, I think not only individuals are thrown, and I think Donald gave a good answer, the parents are responsible, but the culture itself is thrown. They're thrown into that culture that was before. And all they could do is work with what was. It's not as though they're thrown and suddenly there's a tabula rasa for the culture, and they could begin from absolutely nothing and begin all over again. So all they could do is reconstruct by deconstructing and rebuilding what was there already. So you're thrown into a limited situation as it was. It's not that it's clear horizon from the beginning, but you're trapped in the past and looking to the horizon. So that's important to know. And what I want to stress also is that when you're thrown into a situation that's larger than the individual, the culture, the family, and so forth, Peter Zion said something very interesting. He said, what allowed for globalization was, in a sense, he was saying, he didn't put in these words because I don't think he read Heidegger and thrownness, is that when culture used to be that we were all farmers, and that was pretty much the case before the Industrial Revolution, then the family had a lot of children because they needed children not only to raise them in the right way, but to help in the farm work. That was absolutely a necessity besides goodness. The problem with China and much of East Asia is that the Industrial Revolution happened very, very fast. Within one or maybe two generations, where it took 7 generations or maybe more in England and the United States. And so we had a gradual transition into the thrownness. What happened when it's thrown in one generation, for instance, when China opened up, was that in order to make money, people move into the city. And that's the case between the rural culture and urban culture to begin with. When you live in the city, you have a condominium, you maybe have a 2-bedroom apartment, maybe even just a 1-bedroom apartment. And having 7 or 8 children, it's just not going to work, right? It's a nuisance, actually, because they're not helping. They're just an expense. And they're a headache. They're screaming and they're howling all the time. And particularly in such a high-strung society when both parents have to work, this is really problematic. So what happened as a result is that everybody had 1 children. As a matter of fact, to sustain the population, every woman supposed to have should have on average 2.1 children to sustain the children, because there's some women that are not going to have any. And so therefore, to keep a steady state, you have to have that. And right now, China is maybe have, optimistically, 1 per woman, which is half of what's needed. Some say it's even 0.7. So what happened is you have a population collapse. It didn't happen. It didn't seem at first because when they first industrialized, all the farm kids were growing up and they became labor, and it was a very productive society. And as they grow further, then what happened is that those productive laborers began to be high-skilled laborers, and they made a lot of money, and that fed a lot of money in the economy. So that the relationship between consumption, which the younger population would be, and production was sustained by the money that was flowing in exchange. That's a system. However, after 50, 75 years, there are not only not enough children, there's not enough people of the working age. And soon there would not be enough people who are wealthy enough to sustain the money that's necessary to sustain the economy. So the boom that happened in China and Japan, and Korea, was a product of time that moved through the population growth in relationship to consumption, production, and finance. And so as a result, it is inevitable they can't sustain the economy if there's not a consumption. That's why China needs to be an export culture, because they produce too much at one point, and they need to sell it because they don't have enough people consuming. And as a result, it is a productive society. And of course, other people are responding like, whoa, 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 you're making too many widgets, you're making too many cars for us to sustain that. They're going to put a tariff on it. And eventually what happened is when people start putting tariffs on it, you have an additional reduction in terms of consumption of external societies. And that's going to be a problem. It's going to happen. He predicts it's going to happen within the next 10 years, collapse. So there's the problem. The children in this process, because everybody's working, In fact, many of them are working, and the children are back in the countryside, and they're working in the city. They can't tend to the children, so they're not responsible for the thrownness of the children. The children are actually thrown into the world. So the culture itself is thrown, is what I'm saying. It's kind of important to understand the thrownness of the entire culture.
Yeah.
How does a thrown culture respond to the thrown citizens in the culture? That's an important point. That's
That's
it.
great. Thanks. Go ahead, Sharon.
May I just say something to Phil? I hear his point about the children and, China and Japan, and they're having population contracture. But I travel around a lot. And in fact, the other day I was in my clinic and a woman walked in to get an evaluation. And I said to her, so how many children you have? She said 15. In today's day and age, she had 15 children. She was from Zambia. And her sister-in-law came in and they had 12. And that is why immigration is such a very, very important thing for these countries that have population contractures, because other places have population expansions. And again, I think Kenneth Smith talked about the impact of cultures on the way we live, and the way we see ourselves. And that's an important point. She had 15 children. She was not overweight. I said, well, and you talk about living in an apartment with 2 kids. I said, well, how do you raise 15 children? Because that's very different from me. I live in a Western culture. So did she. She said, well, we have a village.
Yeah.
And that was the end of it. The children were fed. Everybody ate. She didn't work. She didn't have a career. Her husband probably had a hunter-gatherer life with a couple of cows and goats and sheep, and all the children were the farm labor. But so, I think we go from one extreme to the other, but everything is a process. Everything is a balance.
Yes.
And so we're not locked into any one thing. The dynamism of it make it very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, Sharon. And thanks, Phil. Zelig, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you, guys. Hearing Phil makes me think of Heidegger's concept, because from what I understand, being in time was you can see his Roman Catholicism when he was writing this and thinking of God in terms of being with the capital B, and being with the lowercase being, as a form of trying to understand, the fallen state. Human beings are in such a fallen state and can't understand the whole. And then reading Kenneth's, I'm trying to make a connection here with Kenneth's text here, where he says that what the Greeks grasped as a savior insight that Christian and modern cultures cannot bear to confront. That you can be a master of yourself, but at the same time you couldn't become a slave to yourself. And I connect that with not only would I say that modern Christian cultures, but also the Jewish cultures in the primitive times. You can hear it in the text when Jesus interacts with the Pharisees and he tells them, you guys are a slave to sin. And they're like, what are you talking about? We've always been free. Our father was Abraham. We've been a slave to no one. And he says, if you sin, you're a slave to sin. But I think that the difference that the Hebraic Christian understanding of self and character was, we are so beyond redemption by our own hand. We need a revelation. We need what you would call the deus ex machina, where the Son, Jesus says, right? He tells the Pharisees this, I tell you the truth, unless the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So I think that the Greeks didn't have that concept. Socrates definitely had the belief that the reason that you committed errors was because of ignorance, most of the time. From what I understand, reading, his discussion of, can you have what is a good wrestler, right? Is a good wrestler someone that he knows that he can be left defeated, as opposed to one who can't even know to be defeated? and Socrates was the one that was better, is that with the one that knows he's ignorant and that he can be defeated. So in that sense, I think the intercommunication here between the Hebraic Christian view of the world and the Greek view of the world is that you can have good institutions. You can be given a law from God from above, right? The Old Testament was a divine social revelation given from above. But there's something so fundamentally wrong with us that we're fallen that we cannot sustain a society, a social order. It always goes into chaos. And so you need to be completely be made renew or be born again. And so when I hear Kenneth talk about the Greek conception, I would say yes. I think the Greeks understood something fundamentally flawed with us, that they even included chaos a part of their worldview. And that's where Christianity with Paul, specifically with Paul, when he interacts with the Greek, yes, you're right. There's something wrong in this world. And the Greeks were like, well, what's your solution? Well, you gotta be, you gotta believe in a God who dies and resurrects. And they're like, what God are you talking to us about? What is this with the resurrection? What God is this? And Paul's all like, no, this is actually the creator of the cosmos. And it's just bringing a completely different new conception to the Greek view of character, that the Greeks were caught off guard a bit. And so when I'm reading Kenneth, I'm like, yeah, there's that understanding of how is it that Christians, and even in our day, or the Hebrews and the primitive culture, didn't think that you can become enslaved to yourself. And I think it's with idiotes, right? You worry about what's only around you. The Pharisees at the time were like, hey, we made deals with the Romans. They let us do whatever we want. We're free. Today in modernity, it's like, hey, I go on Amazon and I can order anything. But you don't really look behind that. Behind that, there's a person who cannot leave working 40 hours a week because
Right.
they'll starve. They have become enslaved to modern day jobs. And in the primitive era, it's like, you don't understand that if you don't stop making deals with the Romans, they will conquer you, and that's actually what happened. So they were slaves not only to a physical world, but also a sin. You know what I mean? So I can see that interdialogue there. It's really enlightened to see how Kenneth is interacting with that, and bringing in the text with what the Greeks really brings it home to me.
Hey, thank you, Zelik, because for what you're saying. This will be very brief. Thronus has a lot of connection with fallenness.
Yeah, it does. Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Exactly. And thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I'm going to call on Stephen and then Joe, and then we'll wrap up for days. So, Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, a background to this story, of course, was the Y2K events. And there was another event. I don't know if Kenneth Smith, I assume he would understand it. And that was in the 80s. We had the home computer started up. Everyone was on with the 88 zero chip, whatever. That was the future. What they believed at the beginning of the 80s was that AI and robots were 10 years down the track. So by 1990, we'll be belting out AI and robots. And Japan was the country that most believed in this. Maybe they'd watched too much manga. I don't know what their problem was, but they invested huge amounts in robotics and AI, huge. And there was some good product which came out, but nothing to justify the amount of money they put in it. Basically, Japan sent itself broke because you've invested this huge amount of money in stuff that just doesn't justify the investment. Investment's got to produce a surplus. So it'll be interesting, if you get back to Kenneth, what he thought of this whole 80s trip where they thought they were going to have, super technology by 1990. And of course, 1990 came and it all crashed. Suddenly people woke up, just wasn't going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Joe, you get the final word today. What's on your
Yeah,
mind?
I mean, I think that there have been a lot of good points made. I don't know if actually, we didn't get to the line maybe where he talks about parents, teachers, and exemplars. But I do think that it's relevant specifically to today's conversation. And so far as that, we can be instructed and we can be given advice. And I was talking to somebody a little bit earlier about this. I said, I was providing them with some of my thoughts on a particular issue. But ultimately, I had told them that whatever it is, it's not. I don't have to live with the consequences of the decision that they make. And why I say that is so important is because that it goes back to the idea of an internal journey, that you have to know yourself and know the decisions that you make are going to be the ones that you're living with, and be able to take feedback, but ultimately understand yourself to know what you can live with. And this goes back to the idea of, what to die for, right? Your ideals, what are your values, knowing yourself. So the importance of that is that it's twofold. It's in the sense that that's the idea of self-knowing, but it's also, more importantly, not imposing on the other person's autonomy. And that's where I think that it comes back to one of the basic things that I talked about a little bit earlier, where is that you need to be able to ask the questions to yourself as opposed to actually having the answers. And because we're all on our individual journey. And so from that perspective, it speaks to, yes, education is something that it informs us, but ultimately, to really truly be free, or however we wish to refer to, that is that it is, it's through the internal journey. And so, because in that particular instance, then it's not necessarily, you're not beholden to circumstance or being thrown into anything. So anyway.
Thanks, Joe.
Hey, thanks. That was very important. Our education has to be not only just education, but teaching people how to think for themselves.
Yeah.
And respect. Yeah, it's a basic human respect.
Yeah.
And again, it comes back to the understanding of our limits. It's understanding boundaries and understanding not only the boundaries that of our knowledge, but the boundaries that someone else has. So
yeah.
So Joe, maybe you're the one to answer that ancient question. Can philosophy be taught?
Yes.
Yes? No.
Absolutely.
Can be lived? Can it be taught?
Yeah, I mean, it can be lived, but can ethics be taught?
Well, maybe it can't be taught, but you could lead them to the water.
Exactly.
That
was it. You can teach.
Or can virtue? I guess that's what the Greeks always ask. Can virtue be taught?
Can virtue be taught? And there's an example that where I think I brought it up in the past, is that where you can, the example of playing a flute or something along those lines, where essentially you can teach people to play a flute and they'll be better than they otherwise would have been, but they're not going to necessarily go to Carnegie Hall.
Right.
And but the bottom line, can it be taught? I mean, and this goes back to the idea of individual progress. How do you become your ideal self? You may not make it to Carnegie Hall, but you'll become the best person that you possibly could be. And so
yes, they could make it to Carnegie Hall as an audience.
An appreciative audience.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's hard. I know. I can't do that.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great week.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Donald. Everybody.
Bye.
Bye.